Next up is my friend Mark Fisher. Mark, I've had the very good pleasure to work with over the last few years as a member of his board. He's the CEO of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, and I really enjoy sitting on that board and watching Mark do amazing things with that organization, and especially related to cleaning up the Great Lakes and lots of other things. It's really been great to watch him build that organization. And have him help with the Canadian American Border Trade Alliance. You may recall in spring, Mark put together a panel, and we had a great discussion then, and he's done it again. He's put together a panel to discuss the carbon border adjustment policy, and it's something that I am not capable of discussing myself, so I'm really happy that Mark put this panel together and has taken this off my plate. And with that, I'll introduce Mark, who will introduce this panel. By the way, Mark will be fielding questions. I won't be. And but enter them the same way. Enter your questions in the chat. And once again, the bios of the speakers are available in the virtual lobby. Take it away, Mark.
Great. Thank you for that kind introduction, Pat. It's always great to be with you and to join the Canadian American Border Trade Alliance's conferences, both in the spring and the fall, albeit, as you said, it is December and it's getting cold. It certainly doesn't feel like fall. And obviously, from my perspective as the CEO of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, this event and these conversations are important and provide us an opportunity to really put a spotlight on the Great Lakes region. And, as everyone knows, this region is made up of 8 states, New York to Minnesota, as well as the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec. It's a region that represents roughly $6 trillion in economic activity, which would make it the 3rd largest economy in the world if it was a country, behind countries like the United States and China, and ahead of major economies like Japan, the United Kingdom, and Germany. It's a region that supports roughly 51 million jobs, or 1/3 of the combined American and Canadian workforce. It's a hotbed of innovation, and it's a region that really does thrive on shared industries and supply chains that cut across the border in so many different ways. So as we talk about supply chain resiliency, as we talk about sustainability, these are big issues for a region like the Great Lakes, and ultimately, how do we maintain the region's competitiveness, and how do we do that in a safe, sustainable way, and how do we deepen that integration between two longstanding economic partners, the United States and Canada. The border, therefore, is front and center in this conversation always. How we manage the border today, how we're going to manage the border of the future. In this region, we have some of the busiest borders, if not the busiest borders in all of North America. 25% of all trade between the United States and Canada goes across one bridge, the Ambassador Bridge. So the border conversation and how we manage that border, again, for today and for the future, is critically important. And the purpose of today's panel discussion is really to highlight for participants a fast emerging topic called border carbon adjustments. And we've got three fantastic panelists that are here today to help us guide us through this conversation. And I will introduce them. The first panelist that will speak today is Katrina Rourke. Katrina is the Vice President for Policy at the Climate Leadership Council. In this role, she develops the details of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends proposal in consultation with 4 dozen founding members, including corporate leaders, environmental nonprofits, and influential individuals. She also manages the Council's research program and supports the Council's advocacy and outreach activities. Prior to joining the Council, Ms. Rourke served as the Director of Energy Policy and Senior Fellow at the R Street Institute, a free market and limited government public policy organization, where she founded the Institute's Energy and Environment Program. We also have with us today Joy Knott. Prior to joining the KPMG Trade and Customs practice in July 2018 as partner, Joy was President and CEO of the Canadian Importers and Exporters Association, which we commonly know as IE Canada, for 8 years. Joy has over 30 years of experience in customs compliance, having started her career in Montreal, worked for over 10 years for well-known customs brokers, freight forwarders, giving her hands-on operational experience to them. She also has worked for global accounting firms and large U.S. banks before returning to KPMG again as a partner in 2018. And then finally, we're very pleased to have Jennifer Schulman with us, who has a PhD in international political economics and has over 15 years of experience conducting pricing and costing analysis. Jennifer is with KPMG. She has led multiple studies for both corporate and nonprofit clients across a wide range of industries such as pharmaceuticals, medical devices, public health, chemicals, professional services, diversified industrial, mining, and energy. And so with those bios and those introductions, it's my pleasure now to turn it over to Katrina, who is really going to give us a 101 of this idea of border carbon adjustments and what it all means. So Katrina, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks for having me today. I've been living and breathing border adjustments for the last several months because, as you say, it's a really fast growing area. So it is my pleasure to be speaking with you about it today as well. I'll give you sort of a conceptual foundation for border adjustments, some of the mechanics that we'll have to figure out, that we'll build upon that already exist, and then a little bit of the sort of opportunity case. Why are border adjustments becoming more popular right now as a subject of discussion? So the conceptual basis. The border adjustment for carbon is an outgrowth of this sort of very common principle, the destination basis for taxation, which means you tax things where they're consumed rather than where produced. The VAT is an example of this, the value added tax. So you apply a VAT where goods are consumed, which means if you're importing a good to a VAT jurisdiction, you apply a VAT. If you're exporting a good from a VAT jurisdiction, you remove the VAT. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, or border carbon adjustment, or whichever vocabulary you choose to use, is an outgrowth of that concept. So you charge goods for the emissions that they release in their manufacture based on where that good is consumed. It's a shift in how we think about climate policy. To date, climate policy has been based on reducing emissions, pricing emissions based on where they are produced. So we're expanding the map of coverage, let's say, for carbon policies. Some of the mechanics. So you can apply a carbon border adjustment on import and remove any carbon fees, any carbon costs paid upon export of a good. For today's purposes, I'll talk about the import side because there's a lot more agreement that should be included than the export side. So a good comes to the border. You need to know if that good should be covered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the emissions associated with manufacturing that good, so you can price those emissions, and then what price you apply to the emissions associated with producing that good. So a question of coverage. The vast majority of examples that we have for covering a good are based on a quality test of whether that good is energy intensive or carbon intensive and trade exposed. So are these goods large contributors to industrial emissions? And do these goods face a lot of international competition? Or are they easily traded? That's been the test so far. Things like steel, aluminum, glass, fertilizer. There's another way of looking at this, which is recognizing that things are global. And so if you're only pricing a steel, aluminum, glass, fertilizer, and not the things that use steel, aluminum, and glass, a car, for example, maybe you're going to shift trade incentives. And so you'll protect the steel, aluminum, and glass industry, but you'll create an incentive to manufacture a car overseas and import it. So this question of where you draw the boundary on goods, that's live right now, trying to figure out how you make a border adjustment consistent with supply chains as they actually exist today. Then you have to measure the emissions. We are very good at measuring emissions from facilities. Now we're trying to learn how you measure emissions associated with individual traded goods, so the carbon intensity of a manufactured good. And companies right now are developing those methodologies and working with each other to harmonize them. So as Mark said, I work with our founding members, many of which are Fortune 100 companies, individual internationally based companies, and they are working on calculating the carbon emissions associated with their supply chains today, really focused on this question of the carbon intensity of the goods that they purchase so that they can tell their customers the carbon intensity of the goods that they produce. As that transition is working out, moving from facilities-based calculations to goods-based calculations, we're getting a clearer understanding of how you price the emissions associated with goods. And then the last question, what do you charge? So the vast majority of CBAMs are at their foundation, assuming that the carbon price at the border is going to be an extension of an existing domestic carbon price. So the European Union announced a carbon border adjustment mechanism in July to take place later this decade. The foundation for the price is the emissions trading system in the European Union. So that'll set the price. A lot of the proposals about border adjustments in various jurisdictions do the same thing. What's their proposal for a domestic carbon price? That'll be the foundation for the border adjusted carbon price. There's another way of looking at this, including in a proposal introduced in the US Congress, which is to tabulate all of the regulatory interventions and other interventions imposed by government that impose a cost on making goods, add those up and determine what the carbon price implicitly is for the goods that you're covering. That's another way of looking at this. It's a newer concept in the border adjustment space. And so the methodologies for that are presently being worked out. So it's a little bit on how you might build a border adjustment, what you need to think about. And the good news is that at least on the import side, border adjustments fit really well into existing customs schemes. So when goods come across the border, Customs and Border officials will look up that good in the harmonized tariff schedule, where that good came from, and they'll assess a tariff rate. What the carbon border adjustment mechanism would do is just add another rate to this very long table and say this is the value of the carbon border adjustment. So you'll have the tariff rate and you'll have the carbon border adjustment rate. Why is this such an important concept right now? Why do we see the European Union proposing it, the Canadian government considering it, and rumbles of interest from the US government, including these members of Congress, the UK and Japan? Why is 53% of the global economy thinking about this? The answer is environmental ambition is ratcheting up very quickly. To date, domestic carbon policies have largely attempted to lower prices for these industries, these energy intensive and trade exposed industries. Maybe they're exempted from regulation, or the government issues payments to make decarbonization easier on these industries. Maybe they're exempted from emissions trading schemes or get free allowances in emissions trading schemes. The goal has been lower costs on these industries, because we know that decarbonization might tilt the scales in favor of internationally produced goods that can outcompete these domestic industries, and which is now unsustainable. We need to be able to get emissions reductions across the economy, including from these industrial sectors that have to date been insulated from the degree of carbon costs facing partners in maybe the electricity sector, let's say. And so the carbon border adjustment mechanism, border carbon adjustment, allows governments to ratchet up expectations for decarbonization on these industries without sacrificing their competitive position. And what we're understanding now in work on this concept that we call the carbon advantage at the Climate Leadership Council is that the instrument might even be more powerful than that. The US economy and the Canadian economy are extremely carbon efficient compared to the vast majority of international partners, which means imposing a border carbon adjustment might actually position efficient domestic industries to outcompete their international rivals because they are clean. So at the Council, we studied the implications for a border adjustment on the steel industry in the United States. And what we found is that the introduction of this carbon policy, a carbon fee, and a border adjustment allows the US to cut imports of steel in half and increase sales of domestically manufactured steel because that's the cleanest source of steel available to the US economy. So that's why border carbon adjustments are increasing in popularity. We can get more emissions reductions from these sectors, and we can position these sectors to outcompete their international rivals. So happy to answer questions on the border adjustment. Really excited to hear from my colleagues.
Well, thanks for that great 101, that great overview, Katrina. And I'm sure for all of our participants, that was a helpful introduction. I'm next going to turn it over to Joy Knott, a great friend of the Council of the Great Lakes region. Joy, you've been in front and center in trade and customs discussions for a long, long time. Give us a sense of how you're seeing this issue. What's unfolding in Canada? What's your perspective on this issue? As Katrina introduced it. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. You're right. I've spent a long time in the trade and customs and international trade arena, where one thing that I've learned over my 30 plus years of doing this is that the devil's in the details. So I think Katrina just did a great job of a high level overview, but as someone who lives in the weeds, I'm an operationally oriented person. I do trade compliance consulting, and my entire career has been trade compliance. So it's taking these big, broad ideas, and then how do you translate that into operations that actually happen 9 to 5, Monday to Friday? How do these concepts become business reality? So there's a couple of points that I wanted to go over today. So the first thing that I wanted to touch, and I know that we're only have a short period of time, but I just want to sort of touch at a high level what the current environment is for supply chains. I have more questions than I do answers at this point in time about what kind of operational changes would a border carbon adjustment or a carbon border adjustment, either a CBAM like Europe calls it, or a BCA as Canada calls it. Sorry, I got a brain jam there. And then I want to touch very quickly on, Katrina did a great job on what it would potentially look like, but again, the devils are in the details. And then finally, just stopping for a second to take a look at what are these mission intensive, trade exposed EITE sectors that are sort of most common interest today. So Katrina's right when she said the Canadian government is certainly looking at this right now. They opened up a consultation to the Canadian public last August. And then, of course, we had the election and whatnot. So we haven't had any results yet from what that consultation is, but they were looking at basically three things. They wanted to understand the environmental aspects of things, the economic aspects of things, which following me, we'll hear from my partner, Jennifer Schulman, who will sort of touch on that part of it a little bit more. And then overall about how all of this idea connects in with the existing international trade infrastructures that we have in place. So, post-World War II, for the past 70-ish years, we've had the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the World Customs Organization. There's a lot of current international treaties that are in place. There are legislative frameworks that countries around the world have structured their domestic legislation for importing and exporting around these international treaties that have been put out by the WCO. How does all this fit in with all of that, right? And that's where my brain sort of goes. And then being a realist, Canada is part of the G7, but Mark, you've heard me say this many, many times. When you stand back and you look at Canada overall on the world stage, while I am a proud Canadian, I often say that Canada punches above its weight class. We are the second largest landmass in the world. We're the second largest physical country, but we are only the 10th largest by nominal GDP and the 6th largest by purchasing power parity. And then when you look at us from a population standpoint, we're 37th. So compare that to the United States, who's the 4th largest landmass, 3rd largest by population. And, the first/second, because depending on whose numbers you read, China or the US has the largest economy, depending on whose numbers you read. So one of the realities for Canada is we sort of face like a monkey in the middle situation in that we have a free trade agreement with Europe. We have obviously a free trade agreement with the United States and Mexico, which is where the vast preponderance of our volume and our trade sits. But we truly have from a treaties and an agreement standpoint, we truly have a very broad footprint. So if different regions adopt different kinds of schemes or different policies when it comes to these border trade alliances, what does that look like from a Canadian perspective? So stepping back and realizing, I mean, in my 30 plus years of doing this, very rarely do you read about supply chains on the front page of the newspaper. And the fact that right now we're talking in mainstream media about supply chain, issues and supply chains that are backed up, that's making headline news. That's a first in my career. So when you step back and you look at that, you can say, well, it's a result of COVID. Yes, that's partially true. But it's also a result in the fact that there's been a lot of ground shifting that's been happening in the past, I'd say 5 to 7 years, that when COVID hit, it certainly didn't help. So everything from trade tensions between the United States and China, trade tensions between the Europeans and the Russians, and relative to the infrastructure for receiving oil and gas, all of those things have an intense impact on supply chains, in that all it takes is, supply chains are great and they're invisible when they're working well. All it takes is one factor to sort of become unstable, and suddenly supply chains start to emerge as they become problematic. So if you're looking at supply chains today and people are thinking, well, the various factors that I just talked about, trade tensions, now on top of all of that, if you have to put emissions and think about emissions and where are you going to put your manufacturing, with this new layer on top of it, when there's so little that's known and understood at this point, it's just another contributing factor to, I think, noise in the pipeline. So I said earlier that I think in the weeds, right? So when these big concepts come out, how do you operationalize this? So some of the things that I thought about, if I'm a trade compliance professional today and somebody comes to me and says, they want to import a specific widget to a country. Well, of course, the first thing that I do is I think about standard duties and taxes that would apply in a normal course of duty and normal course of business. Then I think about free trade agreements that might apply. Then I think about other government agencies that might have a stake. So for example, if it's food, if it's transportation equipment, other government agencies that may have other regulations that apply to those imported goods, what needs to be done there. And then of course there's marking. In recent years, we've heard about COOL, the country of origin labeling, COOL, became sort of a hot button topic for a while. Now, if you put on top of it, eco labeling might become a reality, so that end consumers can understand when they're making a purchasing decision, the level of greenhouse gases and the sort of the impact on the environment this product has, so that they can make an informed buying decision. What are those rules going to look like? You sort of put all that together, and then you heard Katrina saying, it would sort of be applied like a VAT tax. Well, would it actually be a VAT tax? Because thinking Canada has a VAT at the moment, and if you think of it through that lens, would it be like a VAT tax that CRA would administer like it is today? Or would it be something that CBSA does, and which is where the duties are handled within Canada, the Canada Border Customs Agency? So who would actually be the government agency that we'd be dealing with? The taxing authorities, the border authorities, another authority, Environment Canada? Would filings be done monthly like they are now for most companies when you're talking about GST and VAT? Would they be done on a shipment by shipment basis like they are for customs? Would it be done annually? And I know Jennifer addressed this to some point, but it's still, I think, unclear. Would it be production that's taxed or the product that's taxed? Right? And there's a distinction there. So in that tariff that you're talking about, that Katrina was talking about, would that actually sit in the tariff as it exists today in Canadian legislation, which is owned by the Department of Finance and at the global level is controlled by the World Customs Organization? Or would it sit in another tariff, another piece of legislation that would be cross-referenced, which then could potentially sit under the Income Tax Act if it was treated like a direct tax, the Excise Tax Act if it's treated like an indirect tax in Canada, and would that sit under the WTO at the global level, or would it sit under the OECD? Like these are questions that I don't have answers to at the moment, but I think you sort of get the general gist. And the final thing that that I want to sort of focus on is there's a number of different industry sectors that are going to be impacted by this. And I think everybody thinks steel, they think big, heavy industrial, big smokestack kind of industries are the ones that are impacted. And when I talk to people about this, they often say, well, thank heavens I don't work in that kind of an industry. I work for a food company, or I work for a distributor of children's toys or whatever. So they don't necessarily make the immediate connection that I think this is going to impact a wide range of industries. But in Canada specifically, of course, oil and gas, biggest export that will be impacted. But on the import side of the house, it's automotive vehicles and automotive vehicle parts. And when you think about the Canadian economy and you think about Quebec and Ontario, that's a lot of our imports. And then the one that I think takes a lot of people by surprise, biggest export, larger in export than it is an import, but it's the food and beverage industry. And they will be impacted by this. They've been identified by the Canadian government as an emission-intensive, trade-exposed sector. So the message, I think that my final point is the message that I think everyone listening today really needs to think about is you need to start to think about how this is going to impact your entire supply chain, what your supply chain looks like, and then start to have the conversations internally. Will this be handled by the VP of Tax, the VP of Supply Chain, a trade and customs professional if you happen to have that on staff? Will this be treated by, operations, in-house legal counsel? Who within your company is going to be the owner of this new concept? Because it sort of fits all of those categories, but fits none of them neatly in a traditional sense. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Mark.
That's great. Thank you, Joy. And I think you really tabled some known knowns and some unknown knowns that we need to be thinking about, as this policy develops and as the debates around a carbon border adjustment really pick up pace, I think, in the months and the years ahead. So thank you for doing that. And next, I'll turn it over to Jennifer, who's been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of work, and thinking about the competitiveness angle of border carbon adjustments and what is the potential advantage, as Katrina talked about, but perhaps where are some of the pressure points or disadvantages when we think about these kinds of policies in our competitiveness. So Jennifer, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you today. And from a Great Lakes perspective, I'm also a Canadian, much like Joy, but I born and raised in Toronto, but I did my master's and my PhD at the University of Michigan. So go blue. I'll say that knowing there may be some less than helpful non-Michigan fans out there. I currently do have two roles at KPMG. I am the National Leader of Economic Services, but I also am the global lead partner for KPMG's ESG Advisory Hub, where we focus on ESG business transformation strategy and reporting. Both of those are lenses that I'm going to bring today to BCAs. So, and I'm going to try to pull together some of what both Katrina and Joy were talking about with respect to, I'm going to call them BCAs. I'll stick with that term today, pardon my Canadianism. And I'm going to look at it through both the ESG and the economic lens and try to maybe not make it more complicated, but help explain some of the potential logic behind them as well as the implications of them. What I just want to start off with is, putting on my economics hat, I think one thing that COVID, I'll say, has demonstrated is that we really cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy population. And that also goes forward onto a healthy planet. And we hear a lot about whether it's specifically BCAs or other ESG requirements that are coming. If you operate in Europe, you'll have these already on your plate. It's important to realize and I think recognize that our capital markets have also recognized this, and they've been recognizing this for a few years, but they're now demanding it. What was once a nice to have for purpose-driven companies, or your sustainability report, your annual report, your ESG report is rapidly becoming a have-to-have. Capital markets are now demanding this from their companies. Banks are demanding it from their, in terms of their lending portfolios and things like that. There are now ESG credit ratings, akin to AAA, AA, junk bond, MSCI, S&P. They now have ESG ratings for companies, and these can affect your shareholder and stakeholder value. So to this point, understanding and being able to keep track of your carbon emissions is going to be critical with or without a BCA. So, that's something that as you look down your supply chain, you're going to need to increase your understanding of. And one thing that Katrina mentioned earlier was this notion of rewarding good behavior or punishing bad behavior. And we have seen corporations, historically been rewarded for that environmentally good behavior. You use less carbon, you may get a tax credit. BCAs, like tax, is increasing a cost. It's more of a punishment. It's the stick. It's more so the stick than the carrot. What are BCAs specifically aimed at? As any good economist, I'll talk about leakages. So this is a carbon leakage. This is the notion that essentially, businesses can move their production or their manufacturing locations to countries with relatively laxer emissions constraints. And this is essentially the emission constraint increases your cost of production as a result of climate policy. BCAs, which would be a tax on the product as opposed to the process, is aimed to stop that leakage. It can also, though, cause a shift in consumer purchasing. So, I may sit here in Canada, I may choose to purchase a product that's less expensive, which may be a foreign import of the same product from a jurisdiction that has a laxer emissions policy. Same product, arguably, but I'm going to buy the one that's cheaper. If I'm not there may be regulations or things around, a green product versus a brown product that we'll see, stickers, things like that, depending on the consumer preference. Most consumers, as we know, are inclined to buy if it's the same quality product for the same price, for a lower price, I'll buy the lower price product. So both of these dynamics lead to these notions of carbon emissions. This is why some jurisdictions like Europe and Canada are interested in a BCA. The end dynamic of this, though, is not entirely dissimilar to, for example, companies moving or relocating their intellectual property to a lower tax jurisdiction. Have your royalties come through a lower tax jurisdiction. Not dissimilar to certain companies moving to, I've seen this in the chemical industry, for example. Companies would move to a jurisdiction that has laxer regulations so they can continue to manufacture certain toxic or highly combustible chemicals. Markets adjust. They always do. I think the question here is at what cost? So the first question to my mind is, will the BCAs actually be effective at stopping this carbon leakage? If they can't, what's the alternative, right? So how can we help change, incentivize, try to draw on and incentivize companies to produce products that in a way that reduces carbon emissions? How do we stop companies from shifting their headquarters or their manufacturing facilities location to jurisdictions that have a lower carbon emission policy? How do we stop consumers from shifting towards lower priced products that may be less good for the environment? This raises a question to me also of the post-COVID recovery, right? Bringing up the supply chain. Economic projections over the past 18 months, I would say, have bounced around more than I've seen in my 30 years of working in economics. We look at the GDP forecast for both Canada and the US. They are adjusted, back at the early days of COVID, they were adjusted monthly. They're being adjusted quarterly now. Now we have the dreaded Omicron variant, which is coming, and we don't know what that's going to do just yet. There's labor shortages, but there's also unemployment. And then there's, our latest friend, the inflation factor, and we don't know quite what that's going to do. Is the BCA just going to increase inflation? Is it just going to drive prices up, therefore potentially increasing inflation? There's this general progressive increase in the prices of goods and services in an economy. That's sort of the general definition of inflation. Are we only going to make that worse if we have some sort of, I'll call it a tax or, a custom, something like a duty on the import or export of these goods and services? Is it only going to make matters worse? Will it cause, a reduction in growth or an increase in growth? It's very hard to say. Some companies are finding themselves very purpose-driven, and they clearly want to produce in a way that is environmentally friendly. That doesn't mean they're going to get rewarded for it in the best possible way, although they might. And I want to be mindful of time here today. I believe we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to leave you all with a couple of different questions. One is, essentially, will BCAs cause what's sort of affectionately now known as greenflation? Is that a concern that we should have? And can we afford to increase the costs in supply chains? And this is arguably an artificial increase. If we don't go with BCAs to try to help, solve some of these climate change issues, what are the alternatives? What can we propose? What would you propose in your own jurisdictions as an alternative to a BCA? Is there something that you have in mind? Is there another structure that we can look at to try to better incentivize corporations and consumers to make environmentally friendly choices? And with that, I will pass it back to you, Mark.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you for adding your perspective to this conversation. I think what we're going to find is a lot of unanswered questions, and I think the opportunity for many more sessions like this, as the discussion, as the debate around BCAs in the United States and Canada, around the world, really start to unfold. And I guess my first question would be to Katrina and to Joy. As we look at those discussions, those debates in the United States and Canada, what would be a good resource for participants to go to really start educating themselves a bit more deeply about this issue? Katrina, do you have resources through your council? Joy, as a firm, are you starting to develop a practice, a service in helping to guide companies and others, in thinking through the BCA? Katrina, Joy, what are some available resources that individuals might be able to access to start understanding this issue?
After you,
Katrina.
So if you want to learn more about this concept that we call the carbon advantage, I invite you to visit carbonadvantage.org, a little on the nose. And you can learn more about this ability to engage in carbon policy as a vehicle for competitiveness. In terms of resources for companies, at the council, we work with our founding members to try to be that resource. We've also observed a lot of domestic and international trade associations try to add value here. It's a fast emerging issue. As Joy alluded to, silos across companies are going to have to figure out how they interact in a very new way, bringing sort of voluntary emissions tracking and reporting to have financial implications now. That's a bridge that companies are going to have to cross. So yes, we want to be as helpful as possible. If you have questions about how border adjustments work, I want to know what they are. We're in the business of designing policy and working with members of Congress to figure out what that might look like. So the more questions you ask me, the better resource I can be to them. But I would really like to hear from Joy about how she's directly serving her customers here.
Joy, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Katrina. So I know that the consultation is, I believe, still open with the Canadian Government of Canada. So I really encourage Canadian companies and Canadians listening today to please go to that website and have your say. Write in, with some of, if you've got ideas or thoughts that Jennifer sort of alluded to. Right now, I don't think there's anybody who's, sort of off the cuff excluding ideas. If somebody puts a good idea on the table about how to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, which is very different than a traditional duty. Duties or normal customs duties have been traditionally put in place as a form of protectionism of domestic manufacturing and domestic production. This, what we're talking about, is to protect the global environment. It has nothing to do with international borders. It's about the entire planet. So the fees that we're talking about don't serve the same purpose, which is why they don't neatly fit into any of those silos that I was talking about. So as far as resources go, I know that KPMG has put this first and foremost. It aligns with our values as a firm. And I'm going to sort of refer that to Jennifer, because in her global lead representing Canada here, she can sort of maybe speak a little bit more to what's on the immediate horizon for KPMG as a resource to companies out there who have questions around this.
That's great. Thanks, Joy. Jennifer, are there any specific resources that are out there in the KPMG world that companies, participants in the conference can maybe go to and really start getting a bit more educated about the discussion, the debate, and what's happening and the pace that it might be happening at?
And there are, thank you. I think KPMG, like so many firms, I'll say, to be fair, around the world, this is a critical issue. We do have, there's an initiative at KPMG called KPMG Impact. If you go to, if you just Google that, you'll find a number of helpful resources in the tax space, but also in supply chain management to help companies better understand the numerous tax issues that are popping up as a result of ESG issues, not just BCA, but a number of other initiatives, EU taxonomy, anything along those lines. There seems to be no shortage right now, as well as better understanding of your emissions down your supply chain, which can be a very challenging issue, especially if you are not a vertically integrated organization and you need to track your the companies you're procuring from. So there's a number of different question marks around this right now, and so I would encourage you all to go to KPMG Impact and take a look at some of the resources there.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. We do have one question. Go ahead, Joy.
I was going to say, I just wanted to add one more thing. I spoke earlier about how all these different things need to be considered when looking at supply chains, because right now I know companies are looking at moving supply chains for reasons outside of what we're talking about today, but it's really becoming three-dimensional chess. And I strongly encourage all companies to stand back and to, at this point in time, really start to think about where in 2022, which is very shortly upon us, what kind of exercise they plan on taking internally to start to ask themselves these questions so that they get a good idea formulated as a management team so that they know what kind of service providers to potentially call to the table to help them to diagnose, for example, their supply chain. So I just wanted to put that out there because this is like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in your head, right? When you're looking at all these factors. So sorry, Mark, back to you.
No, well, that's actually a really good point. I think given that more than 50% of the total value of goods traded back and forth across the border is the result of the Great Lakes region, I think this is an issue that companies have to grapple with and really have to get their operations aligned to, in a fairly quick order. So thank you for providing some insights in terms of those resources and where people can go, and really appreciate that. One question that's come in from the audience, and I suspect that this is an unknown right now, and it's a question from Paul Zwijak, who asks and says, as a company who's just recently implemented automation of transactions, how would carbon border calculations be integrated? Another challenge for industry managing thousands of transactions. I suspect that there isn't an easy answer to that question. So maybe it's a stay tuned. But Joy, given that you really think about operations, how would you respond to Paul?
That's exactly where my brain is going. So in Canada, we're about to pull a trigger on a new program.
I think you might be accidentally on mute, Joy.
Oh, I didn't touch it. Can you hear me now? Okay. So
go ahead. I can't hear you.
Okay. So that's exactly the kind of question that I ask myself all the time, because that's where the rubber hits the road, is that level of operationalization. In Canada, we're about to launch a new program across the country called CARM, where it's going to impact every single importer is suddenly going to have a different relationship with their customs broker. The way that data travels and the way that data is handled is going to be a little bit different. And government's visibility to data and to be able to process and analyze mass amounts of data is going to be different. So I don't have an answer, I should say, for that question right now. It's definitely a stay tuned, excellent question. And it's where my brain goes every day on this stuff. And I don't know the answers to it yet. I think we have to get a little bit closer. The governments have to get a little bit closer in announcing what each government's actual program is going to look like, so that people like Paul and I can actually start to put, operational boundaries around, well, then how will we get this done Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of thing.
That's great. Thanks, Joy. And we've hit the 12 o'clock mark, the end of our panel. On behalf of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, the Can-Am Border Trade Alliance, I want to thank Katrina, Joy, and Jennifer for participating in today's panel about the border carbon adjustment. As I mentioned before, it is a quickly evolving issue. I think we're going to hear a lot more about it in the weeks and months and years ahead. Thank you for providing, I think, an excellent overview of the ins and outs of a BCA. And I suspect participants will discover there's a lot more that they need to learn. And I encourage people to go to the Climate Leadership Council and KPMG Impact and KPMG and Joy and Jennifer to really start getting your head wrapped around these issues and how it might impact your operations. And so again, on behalf of the Council of the Great Lakes Region Can-Am Border Trade Alliance, thank you for joining us today, and really appreciate your time and attention to this issue.